cellular respiration is going to basically be the opposite in a way of photosynthesis. We're going to be looking at how organisms take food molecules like sugar and turn them into ATP. Because remember, organisms can't use that chemical energy directly, so they need to turn it into ATP to be able to fuel work in their cells and, moving things around and so forth. So the next slide does have a spider on it. I told you I'll try and remember to warn you whenever one of those is coming up. So how do the living organisms fuel their actions? Cellular respiration. And cellular respiration is done by those organisms with mitochondria. So just like photosynthesis is done by organisms that have chloroplasts, cellular respiration is done by those organisms with mitochondria. We're going to see there are multiple steps to cellular respiration, and one of those steps does not require a mitochondria. So there are organisms that can do part of respiration, but you have to have a mitochondrion in order to do the whole thing. So we're going to do the same thing with cellular respiration that we did with photosynthesis. We're going to do big picture, so take a look at the inputs and outputs, and then we're going to take a look at the steps in detail. We're taking a look first at inputs, and let me grab my pen real quick. So inputs, we've got oxygen and we've got sugar. So again, when you write the equation, you can write it however you want. I'm going to write it as the chemical equation. So C6H12O6. Remember that's sugar. So these are the inputs. And so we're going to get oxygen from the air, so breathing it in, and you get sugar and other molecules. We'll see what other molecules can be used for this process later on. And you see that that's not just animals. So a lot of people think that cellular respiration is just animals, but it's also going to be plants and other organisms that have mitochondria like fungi. So those organisms are going to take that oxygen and the sugar, and they're going to take it through the process of cellular respiration, the different steps, and then the outputs are going to be carbon dioxide that you breathe out, and ATP, which is our goal, and then water. So the equation would be CO2 and water and ATP. And ATP is just a form of energy, like light is a form of energy. So, and it's a form of kinetic energy because you can use it to do work. It's kinetic energy when it's being used. So it is a form of potential energy until it's used. This should look familiar because this equation is cellular respiration. If you draw the arrow going the other way and put light here instead of ATP, you've got photosynthesis. Photosynthesis goes this direction, right? Light, water, carbon dioxide gets you sugar and oxygen. And going this direction, oxygen plus sugar gets you carbon dioxide, water, and ATP. Right? So that's the big picture. The other thing that you need to know, so photosynthesis was 2 steps, right? The photo and the synthesis. Cellular respiration is 3 steps. So we're going to look at the 3 different steps. The steps, just real quick, are glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. And most of that is going to be getting the materials ready to make ATP, because the biggest ATP payoff, if you want to think of it that way, in other words, where we make the most ATP, is going to happen in the last step, the electron transport chain. That's where we're going to make 90% of the ATP during cellular respiration. So very little of the ATP is made in the first two steps. Almost all of it is going to be made in that last step. Now let's take a look at the three steps. So like I mentioned, we've got glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. We're going to start first with glycolysis. Glycolysis, that's the first step. Glycolysis is used by all organisms, actually. So it's used by both eukaryotes, so the organisms that have organelles like a nucleus and mitochondria, and it's also used by prokaryotes, so organisms without a nucleus or other organelles. So in the next set of lectures on cells, we'll get more into details on this, but we're going to be looking at those cell parts. But for what we're looking at, what we need to know is that these prokaryotes, simple cells, eukaryotes, more complex cells, but all of them can use this first step in cellular respiration, glycolysis, because it's the universal energy releasing pathway because of where it happens in the cell. So let's take a look at glycolysis. So glycolysis, it's going to take place in the cytoplasm. So here we've got a sketch of our cell. So here's the cytoplasm. The cytoplasm is just a jello-like goo that everything in the cell is hanging out in. And so it's where chemical reactions can happen and also where all of the cell parts are. So glycolysis is one of the chemical reactions that happens in the cytoplasm. And you can see here, this guy that is lit up, that's the mitochondria. And so we're going to use that in later steps. So we're going to start glycolysis off with two things. And we're going to start off with, we're going to use glucose. And that's actually what the name means. It means glucose, glyco, and lysis. Lysis means to break. So we're going to break glucose, all right? And the first part, we're going to take that glucose and we're going to add 2 ATP. I know that sounds weird because the point of cellular respiration is to make ATP. But you need to put some energy in order to break that glucose apart. So we're going to spend 2 ATP, put energy in so that we can break it. And when we put the ATP in, it makes the glucose unstable, so it will break. When that glucose breaks, when it lyses, then we get the energy out. And you can see we get more than 2 ATP. We get 4 ATP, and we get 2 molecules called NADH. These might look familiar or similar to what we saw with photosynthesis. We saw in the photosynthesis it made NADPH, and they're very similar. These are energy storing molecules, and we're going to use these later on in cellular respiration. And we also make water. So we're going to make energy molecules, ATP, NADH. We're going to make water, and we're going to make the 2 new pieces called pyruvate. So we've taken the glucose, broken it in half, and we've made 2 pyruvate molecules. That gets us to the end of glycolysis. So glycolysis, again, happens in the cytoplasm. And at the end of it, I'm going to sum up what we get. So this process is enough for single-celled organisms like the prokaryotes and even some single-celled eukaryotes. So it's enough to just get their energy requirements since they're only 1 cell big. So from 1 glucose, the net result, so if you think about like your paycheck, you have a gross paycheck and then a net paycheck. The net is what you get after taxes. Same idea here, right? The net is what you get after having to pay for the reaction. So you had to pay 2 ATP. So the net result is you get 2 molecules of pyruvate, you get 2 ATP molecules because you had to pay 2, you got 4, so you get 2 to take with you, and then you get your NADH molecules to store energy in the form of high energy electrons. Like I said, we're going to see and use these guys again later. These ATP molecules are going to get to go and be used somewhere in the cell because that was the point, right? We want to make energy in the form of ATP. So they'll go and be used. Now, any multicellular organisms like ourselves, multicellular eukaryotes, are going to keep going. So like I said, this is enough for single cell organisms, prokaryote or eukaryote. But the multicellular organisms are going to take the pyruvate and the NADH and keep going. So that's glycolysis. So now let's take a look at the Krebs cycle. So Krebs cycle, this is going to now take and extract more energy from the pyruvate and break it the rest of the way apart. Before the Krebs cycle starts, there's a little bit of preparation to do. So remember, glycolysis happens in the cytoplasm, but the rest of cellular respiration happens in the mitochondria. And so the first part of this preparatory phase, or the prep step, as some people call it, I like that too, is to take the pyruvates and move them into the mitochondria. So remember, in glycolysis, we broke the glucose into 2 pieces. And so those 2 pyruvates are going to get moved into the mitochondria before we start the Krebs cycle. And it's going to also convert the pyruvate. So it's going to put the pyruvate through some steps to turn it into this molecule called acetyl-CoA. It's just so it's easier to work with in the Krebs cycle. While it's doing that, it actually makes some more stuff. So you can see it makes some NADH, so it makes some more of those high energy molecules, and it makes some of the carbon dioxide that we breathe out. So just getting ready for the Krebs cycle ends up making some of the things that we end up with at the end of the reaction. So we make some carbon dioxide, we make some NADH that we'll use later on. So now the Krebs cycle. Now, when you look at this, don't freak out. It looks complicated, but you don't need to know, for example, the name of this molecule, that it turns into this molecule. I just want you to see what's being made as you go through the Krebs cycle. And again, it's a cycle, so it just keeps going around and around. So what happens is, with the Krebs cycle, you have your acetyl-CoA, that pyruvate that got converted over, and it gets fed into the cycle and attached so that it takes this guy and makes it into this 6-carbon molecule. Right? Because the goal is to break this apart so we can get all of the energy out of it that we can. So the cycle is going to take that, it's put it into the 6-carbon molecule, and it's going to start tearing it apart. And the first thing that it does as it's tearing it apart is it's going to make more NADH. So it's going to make NADH, and as it does that, it ends up making more carbon dioxide. So that carbon dioxide's released out, we breathe it out, we've got NADH. Then it's going to remake this original molecule over here, so you can see it's not quite the same shape. And as it remakes that molecule, it's going to make some more items. So what is it making along the way? Yeah, it's making ATP, NADH, and then this new guy, FADH2. And FADH2 is just like NADH. It's just a different molecule. And so it's going to be an energy carrier too. And so these guys are going to move to the last step that we'll talk about in the next lecture. So to sum up what we get from the Krebs cycle, we're going to make ATP. Oh, yeah. Yeah, we saw that. Okay. So we're going to make ATP. We're going to make more NADH. We're going to make FADH too. And these guys are going to move on to the last step. And then we're going to make the last of the carbon dioxide. So the Krebs cycle is pulling the last of the energy out of the pyruvate molecule that got converted, and it releases the last of the carbon. The next step, which we're going to talk about in the next video, is the electron transport chain. It's the last part, and again, remember, it's where we're going to make the most ATP.